The world did not end in fire, nor did it end in ice. It ended in a blinding, chaotic kaleidoscope of light. Historians of the modern era referred to it as the dawn of quirks, a romanticized moniker for what was, in reality, a global apocalypse. They wrote of the glowing baby in Ching Ching City as a beacon of the next stage of human evolution. They painted pictures of society bravely marching forward into a new age of superpowered wonder. They were wrong. Izuku Midoriya remembered the dawn. He remembered the screams. He remembered the stench of burning asphalt, the shattered glass of storefronts, and the way the sky looked bruised with ash and smoke as the laws of physics spontaneously unraveled. He had been 14 years old when the world tore itself apart. He had been a normal boy, with a mother who loved him and a father who worked overseas. Then came the fever that swept across the globe. Then came the mutations. People began to change. A man on the street would suddenly spontaneously combust, unable to control the inferno erupting from his pores. A woman would scream as her bones expanded, tearing through her flesh to form grotesque armor. Fear bred paranoia, paranoia bred violence, and the fragile veneer of civilized society collapsed in a matter of months. Amidst the chaos, Izuku's own change was silent. There was no fire. There was no monstrous transformation. There was only a profound, sudden stillness within his chest. A quiet, thrumming warmth that felt like a heavy iron anchor dropping into the very center of his soul. He didn't know it then, but that was the birth of Aegis. The absolute authority over the metaphysical energy of quirks. The power to contain, seal, neutralize, and absorb the rampant genetic anomalies plaguing mankind. It also came with a secondary, inescapable side effect. His cells froze in time. By the time the first decade of the quirk era passed, his mother was gone, taken by the riots. His father never returned. Izuku was 24, but when he looked in the mirror of a looted, abandoned convenience store, a 14-year-old boy stared back. Wide, verdant eyes, a smattering of freckles, and a mop of unruly green hair. He was untouched by time. Untouched by the disease of age. He was entirely, terrifyingly alone. Until the rainstorm in the ruins of what used to be Tokyo. The memory was etched into the bedrock of Izuku's mind, refusing to erode even after 2 centuries. He had been scavenging for canned food in the flooded streets when he heard the coughing. It was a wet, rattling sound, emanating from beneath the collapsed awning of a rusted bus stop. Izuku had drawn the steel pipe he carried for protection and approached cautiously. There, huddled beneath a filthy, waterlogged tarp, were 2 boys. One was impossibly frail, his skin a sickly, translucent pale, with a shock of stark white hair clinging to his forehead. He was shaking violently, gripped by a fever that threatened to consume him. The other boy was older, perhaps 12 or 13. He had stark white hair as well, though his eyes were a piercing, vibrant red. The moment Izuku stepped into view, the older boy threw himself over his sickly sibling, baring his teeth like a cornered wolf. His hands sparked with an unstable, erratic energy, a desperate warning to stay back. Don't come any closer. The red-eyed boy had screamed, his voice cracking with desperation and terror. I'll kill you! I'll take it from you and I'll kill you! Izuku had looked at the sparking hands. He felt the hum of Aegis in his chest, recognizing the volatile, dangerous nature of the boy's emerging quirk. A lesser man would have run. A fearful man would have struck the boy down. Instead, Izuku dropped his steel pipe. It clattered loudly against the wet pavement. He knelt down in the mud, ignoring the rain soaking his ragged clothes, and reached into his satchel. He pulled out a slightly crushed, but unopened, tin of peaches. He slid it across the ground until it bumped against the older boy's knee. You need to eat, Izuku had said, his voice soft, yet carrying an ancient, unnatural weight for a boy who looked 14. And he needs medicine. I have a camp near here. It's dry. There's a fire. The red-eyed boy stared at the tin, then up at Izuku. The hostility in his gaze fractured, replaced by the heartbreaking vulnerability of a starving, terrified child. Why? He whispered. Everyone else, they just hurt us. Because we're freaks. Because the world is broken, Izuku replied gently, offering a hand. And we have to take care of each other. I'm Izuku. The older boy hesitated for a long time. Finally, the sickly boy beneath him whimpered, coughing up a speck of blood. The older boy's resolve shattered. He grabbed the tin, then reached out and took Izuku's hand. They just call me by my quirk now, but… I'm Shigaraki, the older boy muttered. And this is my little brother. Yoichi. Izuku's heart ached. He pulled the older boy to his feet, then carefully lifted the frail Yoichi into his arms. The child felt lighter than a bundle of kindling. Come on, Izuku said, turning his back to the wind. Let's go home. For a few fleeting years, they were a family. Izuku, despite looking only a year or two older than Shigaraki, became their guardian, their provider, their older brother. He taught them how to read from scavenged books. He taught them how to fight. He taught them morality in a world that had abandoned the concept. But as the years bled into a decade, the cracks began to show. Izuku did not age. The brothers noticed. At first, it was a point of wonder, then a point of quiet reverence. To them, Izuku was something divine, a guardian angel untouched by the decay of the mortal world. But as society began to rebuild itself in twisted, warlord-dominated factions, Shigaraki's quirk blossomed into something terrifying. All for one. The ability to take quirks and give them away. It started with noble intentions. A man whose quirk caused him unbearable agony begged Shigaraki to take it. He did. Then, a group of bandits attacked their camp. Shigaraki took their quirks and slaughtered them. Izuku had been furious, horrified by the casual taking of human life, but Shigaraki had only smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that made Izuku's blood run cold. I protected us, Izuku, Shigaraki had argued, his red eyes blazing with an intoxicating new high. You protect us from the shadows, but I can fix this world. I can take the power from the wicked and give it to the weak. I can bring order to the chaos. I can be a god. You are a man, brother, Izuku had pleaded, grasping Shigaraki's shoulders. Power without restraint is not salvation. It is tyranny. If you walk this path, it will consume you. But the rod had already taken hold. Shigaraki grew resentful of Izuku's stagnant, passive nature. He gathered followers. He built an empire in the shadows. He renamed himself after his power, all for one. The night their family truly shattered, rain was pouring, much like the night they first met. AFO had forced a stockpile quirk upon the frail, unconsenting Yoichi, claiming it would make him strong. Izuku had returned from a scouting run too late. He found Yoichi convulsing on the floor of their sanctuary, and AFO standing over him, cloaked in stolen power, his face twisted into a mask of arrogant megalomania. What have you done? Izuku had roared, releasing the seals on his aegis. The air in the room had turned to lead. The sheer, overwhelming gravitational weight of Izuku's aura cracked the concrete beneath their feet. For the first time in his long life, Izuku prepared to strike down his own brother. AFO had laughed, a sound devoid of the frightened boy in the alleyway. I gave him a gift, Izuku. I gave him life. Join me. You are immortal. We could rule this pathetic world for eternity, they fought. It was a battle that reduced their sanctuary to dust. AFO unleashed a dozen stolen quirks, storms of fire, lightning, and telekinetic force. But Izuku was the aegis. He didn't need flashy powers. He walked through the fire, the flames parting around his skin as his quirk absorbed and nullified the kinetic and thermal energy. He struck AFO with martial precision honed over decades, shattering his brother's jaw and bringing him to his knees. Izuku stood over the tyrant, his hand raised, ready to seal away the all-for-one quirk forever. If he did, AFO would be a normal, mortal man. The nightmare would end before it truly began. But as Izuku looked down into those terrified red eyes, he didn't see a demon warlord. He saw the boy in the ring. He saw the brother who had shared his rations, who had slept by his side in the cold ruins. Izuku hesitated. His hand shook. The glow of the aegis flickered. In that fraction of a second, AFO capitalized on Izuku's mercy. A blast of pressurized air sent Izuku flying through a brick wall. When Izuku dug himself out of the rubble, AFO was gone, and so was Yoichi. That was Izuku's greatest sin. The sin of mercy. Because of that single moment of hesitation, centuries of bloodshed followed. 200 years later, the world had indeed turned. The chaos of the dawn was nothing more than a sanitized paragraph in middle school history textbooks. Society had stabilized. The extraordinary had become mundane. The world was now governed by laws, protected by commercialized, licensed celebrities known as pro-heroes. Izuku Midoriya sat cross-legged on a tatami mat in a small, humble apartment in modern-day Muzurifu, sipping a cup of green tea. The morning sunlight filtered through the sliding glass door, casting long shadows across the room. He still looked exactly 15 years old. His reflection in the tea's surface showed the same unruly green curls, the same rounded, innocent face, the same diamond-shaped freckles. But if one were to look closely into his eyes, truly look past the emerald color, they would see the crushing weight of 2 centuries. They were the eyes of a soldier who had fought 1,000 wars, a monk who had mourned 1,000 lifetimes, a ghost haunting the periphery of history. He was the verdant sentinel, the ancient protector of quirks. Over the centuries, as AFO built his criminal empire, Izuku had waged a shadow war against him. When a quirk mutated into something too dangerous for humanity, a power capable of cracking the tectonic plates, a virus capable of erasing memories, a singularity of nuclear energy, Izuku would appear, hunt the user down, and pull the quirk from their body, sealing it away within the infinite, void-like vault of his own soul. He was the janitor of human evolution, cleaning up the messes that the gods of genetics left behind. He had operated under dozens of names. A wandering samurai in the Edo period, a masked vigilante during the Industrial Revolution, a shadow operative during the turbulent emergence of the Hero Public Safety Commission. But immortality was a lonely, agonizing existence. He had watched generations of friends grow old and wither away into dust while he remained frozen in amber. He had watched his beloved little brother Yoichi die. He had watched Yoichi's quirk, one for all, pass from successor to successor. Izuku had tried to protect them. He truly had. He had fought alongside the second, the third, the fourth. He had held Nanashimura as she bled out, failing once again to kill the monster AFO had become, because AFO had grown too powerful, too cunning, always keeping the hostages of society between himself and Izuku's wrath. Recently, the long war had taken its toll. Izuku was so very tired. 15 years ago, he had decided to rest. He needed a reprieve from the endless blood and the shadow games. He forged adoption papers using favors from an ancient contact within the government. He found a kind, lonely woman named Inko Midoriya, whose own child had tragically been stillborn, and used a very subtle, harmless cognitive manipulation quirk he had stored away in the 1800s to alter the hospital records and the neighborhood's memories. To the world, to the system, and to Inko herself, Izuku Midoriya was born 15 years ago. He played the part of the quirkless, timid child flawlessly. It was a vacation of sorts. For 15 years, he got to experience the warmth of a mother's love. He went to elementary school, learned modern math, watched cartoon heroes on television, and allowed himself to pretend that he was nothing more than a boy. He even tolerated the presence of Katsuki Bikugo. Katsuki was a loud, explosive, arrogant child who lived down the street. When they were toddlers, they had been friends by proximity. When Katsuki's explosion quirk manifested, his ego inflated to the size of a blimp. He started calling Izuku Deku, the useless one. He bullied him, pushed him around, and burned his notebooks. Any normal teenager would have been traumatized. But Izuku was not a normal teenager. He was a 200-year-old warrior. When a 4-year-old throws a tantrum and hits you, you don't feel intimidated. You just feel a profound sense of exasperation. Izuku had let Katsuki bully him because it maintained his cover. It made him invisible. A weak, quirkless, crying victim was the last place AFO's spies would ever look for the immortal sentinel. So, Izuku cried on command. He flinched when Katsuki yelled. He played the role of Deku so perfectly that he almost convinced himself it was real. But the vacation was over. Izuku set down his teacup. On the television in the corner of the room, a news anchor was loudly narrating the morning broadcast. And in local news, Yue High School's entrance exam begins today. Thousands of hopeful middle schoolers will compete for a spot in Japan's most prestigious Hero Academy. This year's roster is rumored to be the most competitive yet, with experts predicting. Izuku muted the television with a flick of a remote. He stood up, stretching his limbs. His bones popped in a satisfying rhythm. 10 months ago, Izuku had broken his own rules. He had been walking home from Aldera Junior High when a villain made of literal sludge had attacked Katsuki in an alleyway. Izuku had been ready to step in, to drop his disguise and neutralize the villain, but then he had arrived. All Might. The symbol of peace. The eighth wielder of Yoichi's legacy. Izuku had watched from the crowd, hiding his immense aura, as All Might saved the day. But that wasn't what changed everything. Later that evening, using enhanced hearing he had acquired in the early 1900s, Izuku had eavesdropped on a conversation between All Might and Katsuki Bakugo on a secluded beach. He had heard All Might offer Katsuki the power of one for all. Izuku had nearly marched down to the beach and slapped Toshinori Yagi across his gaunt, sunken face. Of all the people in the world, he chose the explosive, arrogant, self-centered brat with a god complex? It was a disaster waiting to happen. Katsuki was powerful, yes, but he lacked the quiet, self-sacrificing heart that Yoichi had possessed. Yet, Izuku didn't interfere. The quirk had been passed. Yoichi's soul, dwelling within the power, had accepted Katsuki, for whatever reason. If Katsuki Bakugo was the ninth, then he was the final piece on the board. The final weapon against AFO. Izuku knew that AFO, wherever he was hiding, would sense the transfer of power. The Shadow War was about to step into the light. Izuku could no longer sit on the sidelines and play the quirkless victim. He needed to be close to the ninth. He needed to protect the legacy of his little brother. He needed to ensure that this time, All for One was put into the ground permanently. To do that, Izuku Midoriya was going to UA High School. Izuku! Breakfast is ready, sweetie, the voice of Inko Midoriya called out from the kitchen. Izuku's hardened, ancient eyes immediately softened. He let out a long, quiet breath, forcing the tension from his shoulders. He slumped his posture slightly, widened his eyes, and plastered on a bright, nervous, 15-year-old smile. Coming, Mom! He called back, his voice shifting an octave higher into its usual boyish pitch. He walked into the kitchen. Inko was bustling about, flipping eggs in a pan, her telekinesis floating a plate of toast onto the table. She looked at him and smiled, though her eyes were crinkled with worry. Are you sure about this, Izuku? She asked, setting the pan down. The UA Hero Course exam. It's incredibly dangerous. And your quirk, it only just came in a few months ago. That was the lie he had planted. After 10 months of intense training, Izuku had miraculously manifested a late-blooming quirk. He called it kinetic absorption, a minor ability he had taken from a villain in the 1920s. It was a simple power that allowed him to store kinetic energy and release it as brute strength. It was flashy enough to pass for a standard emitter quirk, but mundane enough to fly under the radar. I'll be fine, Mom, Izuku said, taking a piece of toast. He gave her a reassuring, wobbly smile. I've been training really hard. And I have to try. I want to save people, Inko sighed, stepping forward to cup his cheek. You have such a big heart, Izuku. Just promise me you won't do anything reckless. If it gets too dangerous, just run. Okay? Izuku leaned into her touch. For all his centuries, the warmth of a mother's hand was something he still cherished above all else. I promise, Mom. I'll be careful. I've survived apocalyptic wars, collapsing buildings, and the wrath of gods, Inko, he thought fondly. A few robots in a controlled environment won't leave a scratch. 30 minutes later, Izuku was walking down the cherry blossom-lined streets toward the train station, dressed in his black middle school gakurin. The crisp spring air was refreshing. The petals falling around him reminded him of Kyoto in the 1700s, when he had spent a decade living as a swordsmith, trying to find peace in the art of the blade. Hey! Shitty Deku! The peace was shattered instantly. Izuku didn't flinch. He didn't jump. He just stopped walking and turned his head. Striding down the pavement toward him was Katsuki Bakugo. The blond boy looked like a coiled spring, his hands stuffed aggressively into his pockets, his red eyes glaring daggers at Izuku. He had grown taller, broader, his muscles corded from whatever intense physical training All Might had put him through over the last 10 months. He practically radiated a suffocating, aggressive heat. Kaken, Izuku said, his voice neutral. Bakugo stomped up to him, stopping mere inches from Izuku's face. He leaned down, trying to use his height advantage to intimidate. What the hell are you doing walking this way? Don't tell me you're actually going to the UA exam. I am, Izuku said simply. Bakugo scoffed, a tiny explosion popping in the palm of his right hand. The smell of burnt caramel and ozone filled the air. You've got a death wish, Pebble. I don't care if you miraculously manifested some pathetic, weak-ass strength quirk at the last minute. You're still a Deku. You're still a pebble in my path. UA is for the elite. It's for me. If you get in my way, I'll blow you to kingdom come. In the past, Izuku would have stuttered. He would have waved his hands frantically and backed away, playing the role of the terrified subordinate. But today, the act was dropped. Izuku looked up at Bakugo. He didn't look at him the way a rival looks at a rival. He looked at him the way a weary grandfather looks at a toddler throwing a tantrum in a grocery store. It was a look of profound, unbothered pity. Kaken, Izuku said softly, his tone completely devoid of fear. It wasn't loud, but it carried a strange, heavy resonance that made the hairs on the back of Bakugo's neck stand up. You are very loud. Bakugo froze. His brain short-circuited for a fraction of a second. This wasn't the script. Deku was supposed to cower. Deku was supposed to shake. But the boy standing in front of him wasn't shaking. His posture was perfectly straight, his breathing was terrifyingly even, and his green eyes were dark, fathomless pools. What did you just say to me? Bakugo snarled, grabbing the collar of Izuku's uniform, his palms smoking. You getting cocky because you can lift a few dumbbells now, you quirkless reject? Izuku looked down at the hand grabbing his collar, then back up to Bakugo's furious red eyes. For a brief, haunting second, Izuku didn't see Bakugo. He saw Shigaraki, standing in the rain, consumed by arrogance and a lust for power. A tiny, microscopic sliver of Izuku's true aura leaked out. It wasn't a physical attack. It was a manifestation of pure, concentrated killing intent honed over 200 years of slaughtering monsters. It was the presence of an apex predator, Bakugo gasped. His pupils dilated. For a single, agonizing heartbeat, every instinct in his body screamed at him that he was holding a live nuclear bomb. The air around Izuku felt so dense it was suffocating. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Bakugo's hand involuntarily released Izuku's collar, as if he had touched dry ice. He stumbled back half a step, his chest heaving, a cold sweat instantly breaking out on his forehead. Izuku calmly reached up and brushed an invisible speck of dust from his collar. The crushing aura vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving the spring air feeling light and normal once again. Izuku offered Bakugo a small, polite smile. It was a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Good luck on the exam, Kaken, Izuku said pleasantly. I'm sure you'll do great. Try not to hurt yourself. With that, Izuku turned and continued walking down the street, his footsteps completely silent against the pavement. Bakugo stood frozen in the middle of the sidewalk, staring at Izuku's retreating back. His heart was hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. His hand was trembling. He looked down at his palms, then back up at the green-haired boy. What the hell was that? Bakugo thought, his mind racing. That wasn't Deku. That wasn't him. What the hell was that feeling? Anger quickly masked the fear. Bakugo gritted his teeth, sparking an explosion in his hands to stop the trembling. You're dead, Deku! He roared at the empty street. I'm gonna crush you! Izuku heard the shout, but didn't bother to turn around. He just sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Yoichi, Izuku thought, speaking to the soul of his brother across the void of time. You always did have terrible taste in successors. First a muscle-bound oaf who breaks his bones, and now a child with the temperament of a feral wolverine. The walk to Yui High School took 20 minutes. When Izuku finally stood before the massive, towering gates of the academy, he paused. The structure was a testament to modern engineering. A sprawling campus of glass and steel shaped like a massive H. Hundreds of teenagers were pouring through the gates, their faces alight with excitement, nervous energy, and dreams of glory. They wore different school uniforms, chattering loudly, hyping each other up. Izuku stood still in the stream of moving bodies like a stone in a rushing river. He looked at the towering glass buildings. He remembered when this land was nothing but a forest. He remembered fighting a man who could turn trees into venomous stakes on this exact spot in the winter of 1912. He remembered the blood that had soaked into the soil beneath the polished concrete. Heroes. Society had commercialized the concept. They had put it on billboards, sold it on lunchboxes, and ranked it on leaderboards. These children walking through the gates didn't know what true war was. They didn't know the horrors of the quirk singularity. They thought being a hero meant wearing a flashy costume and waving at cameras. Izuku didn't blame them. He had fought for 200 years specifically so that they could afford to be this naive. He had carried the darkness so they could walk in the light. But the light was fading. The skies were darkening. All for One was moving his pieces in the shadows. Izuku could feel it in his bones. The tyrant was preparing for his endgame. Out of the way, extra! A shoulder bumped into Izuku. He easily absorbed the kinetic force, barely swaying, while the tall boy who had bumped him stumbled awkwardly. Izuku offered a polite nod of apology, playing the part of the meek student once more, and began to walk toward the main auditorium. This is it, Izuku thought. He reached up and lightly touched his own chest, right over his heart, where the core of his aegis burned like a quiet, eternal star. I will not fail this time. I will protect the ninth. I will guide him. And when the time comes, Izuku's eyes hardened, gleaming with an emerald fire that had struck terror into the hearts of villains for 2 centuries. I will finish what I started in the rain, brother. I will take your power, and I will put you to rest. The verdant sentinel stepped through the gates of Yue High School, and the world began to turn once more. Inside the surveillance room deep within the Yue campus, a small, white-furred creature wearing a tailored suit sat before a massive bank of monitors. Principal Niza sipped a cup of Earl Grey tea, his highly intelligent, beady black eyes darting across the screens, analyzing the hundreds of applicants pouring into the auditorium. Standing behind him was a tall, disheveled man wrapped in a yellow sleeping bag. Shota Aizawa, the underground hero Eraserhead, looked thoroughly exhausted before the day had even begun. Any promising ones this year? Aizawa asked, his voice a dry rasp. Oh, quite a few, Niza replied cheerfully. Endeavor's son is among the recommended students, of course. And there is a boy with a remarkably powerful explosion quirk from Alderete Junior High. Katsuki Bikugo. His file suggests a very aggressive temperament, but undeniably high combat potential, Aizawa grunted. Great. Another loudmouth glory hound. Exactly what I don't want to deal with, Niza chuckled. He reached forward to switch one of the camera feeds, cycling through the crowd. Suddenly his paw stopped. On screen 4, the camera focused on a plain-looking boy with green curly hair and freckles, walking quietly toward the auditorium. The boy's file flashed on a secondary monitor. Name Midoriya Izuku. Quirk, kinetic absorption, late bloomer. Notes, average grades. No prior athletic achievements. Niza hummed, leaning closer to the screen. What is it? Aizawa asked, peering over the principal's shoulder. Looks like a typical background character. With a late bloomer quirk like that, he'll likely be crushed in the practical exam. Perhaps, Niza said slowly. His animal instincts, honed by a quirk that granted him unparalleled intelligence and perception, were screaming at him. He watched the way the Midoriya boy walked. It was subtle, invisible to the untrained eye. But Niza noticed it. The boy's footsteps didn't align with the normal gait of a teenager. His center of gravity was flawlessly balanced. His head didn't swivel nervously like the others. His eyes tracked the environment with the terrifying, passive efficiency of a radar sweep. When another student bumped into him, the boy didn't flinch or brace. He instinctively shifted his weight, redirecting the kinetic energy flawlessly into the ground before the other student even realized what happened. It was the movement of a master martial artist. No more than that. It was the movement of someone who had lived in constant combat for a lifetime. Aizawa, Niza said softly, setting his teacup down. The cheerfulness was entirely gone from his voice. Yeah? Watch screen 4. Tell me what you see. Aizawa squinted, his dark eyes focusing on the green-haired boy. Aizawa was an underground hero. He lived in the shadows. He knew how to spot a threat. He watched the boy walk up the steps to the auditorium. He watched the absolute lack of wasted movement. He saw the boy's eyes. Even through the grainy security footage, those green eyes looked profoundly, impossibly old. Aizawa felt a cold chill run down his spine. The hairs on his arms stood up. That kid, Aizawa muttered, his hand instinctively reaching for the capture scarf hidden beneath his sleeping bag. He has no openings. None. If I had to ambush him right now, I don't think I could. Niza steepled his paws together, a deep frown marring his features. A 15-year-old boy with a late-blooming quirk, with the situational awareness of a veteran pro, and a complete absence of fear. Niza pulled up a separate, encrypted file on his terminal. It was a folder he rarely opened. It contained blurry, black and white photographs dating back decades. A vigilante in the shadows of Hosu in the 1990s. A mysterious figure spotted during the Destro Wars. A myth known in the deepest, darkest corners of the underworld as the Sentinel. Niza looked at the blurry face of the myth in a photo from 50 years ago, then looked at the live feed of Izuku Midoriya. The resemblance was uncanny. Aizawa, Niza said, his tone dead serious. I want you to keep a very, very close eye on Izuku Midoriya during the practical exam. Do not blink. You think he's a villain spy? Aizawa asked, his eyes narrowing. No, Niza replied softly. I think he is something much, much older. And if I am right, this year's hero course is about to get very complicated. Down in the auditorium, Izuku took his seat in the middle rows. He ignored the loud, boisterous presentation by the voice hero, Present Mike. He ignored the obnoxious shouting of a blue-haired boy with glasses who tried to reprimand Katsuki. Izuku simply sat, breathing slowly, feeling the hum of the Aegis in his chest. The game had begun. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he wasn't in a high school auditorium. He was standing in the ash of the old world, the rain washing the blood from his hands, the ghost of his brother crying out into the void. I am the shield that guards the realms of men, Izuku whispered in his mind, reciting the oath he had written by a campfire 200 years ago. I am the watcher in the dark. I am the chain that binds the beast. He opened his eyes. They were bright, innocent, and smiling. Let's pass this exam, the 15-year-old boy whispered to himself. The gates of Battle Center loomed like the entrance to a modernized coliseum. The towering steel walls, designed to contain the chaotic destructive capabilities of hundreds of super-powered teenagers, gleamed under the late morning sun. Izuku Midoriya stood in the middle of the expansive courtyard, surrounded by a sea of nervous applicants. To his left, a boy with a mutation quirk was hyperventilating into a paper bag. To his right, a girl with engines in her calves was doing frantic stretches, her face pale with anxiety. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, ozone, and raw, unfiltered terror. Izuku breathed in, letting the crisp air fill his lungs, and felt a profound sense of boredom. It wasn't arrogance. It was simply the inevitable perspective of a man who had lived through the quirk singularity's darkest nights. He had stood in trenches filled with mud and blood while warlords rained literal fire down from the sky. He had fought men who could tear apart the fabric of reality with a thought. To him, this highly regulated, commercialized exam felt less like a crucible and more like a children's playground. Yue has certainly spared no expense, Izuku mused, his emerald eyes tracing the structural integrity of the massive mock city beyond the gates. Concrete, reinforced steel, impact-resistant glass. It's a remarkable facsimile of urban warfare. But the atmosphere is all wrong. There is no threat of death here. These children are playing a game with points. Right, let's start. President Mick's voice boomed from the observation tower, startling the crowd of teenagers. They jumped, looking around in confusion. What's the matter? There are no countdowns in a real battle. Run, run, run! The die has been cast. The gates began to slowly grind open, but before they were even halfway parted, Izuku was already moving. He didn't sprint like a track star. He slipped through the opening with the fluid, silent grace of water flowing over a stone. While the other applicants were still processing President Mick's command, Izuku was already 3 blocks deep into the mock city. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, tapping into the Aegis core burning within his soul. He didn't need to open the vault. He didn't need the world-breaking powers he had accumulated over 2 centuries. He just needed to activate the shallowest layer of his arsenal, the kinetic absorption quirk. He had stripped it from a petty thief in London in the late 1890s. The thief had been using it to survive carriage accidents and win bare-knuckle boxing matches. It was a simple, rudimentary power. It allowed the user's cells to act as shock absorbers, taking in kinetic force, be it a punch, a fall, or the friction of a sprint, and storing it. The user could then release that energy to enhance their own physical strength or speed. It was perfect. It was believable. It was exactly the kind of quirk a late bloomer might manifest. A mechanical whirring shattered the silence of the alleyway. From the shadows of a full apartment complex, a one-pointer robot rolled forward. Its single red optical sensor locked onto Izuku. Target acquired, the machine synthesized, raising a blunt, pneumatic appendage. Izuku didn't alter his pace. As the robot lunged, swinging its metal arm with enough force to dent a car, Izuku simply stepped into the strike. He didn't dodge. He let the metal arm slam directly into his left shoulder. To the cameras watching above, it looked like a rookie mistake. But at the moment of impact, Izuku's kinetic quirk activated. His flesh didn't bruise. His bones didn't crack. The kinetic energy of the blow was swallowed entirely by his body, converted into a bright, buzzing warmth in his muscles. Without missing a beat, Izuku pivoted. Using the exact amount of energy he had just absorbed, he delivered a precise, open-palm strike to the underside of the robot's primary chassis, right where the pneumatic joint connected to the central battery. Crack! The force bypassed the robot's heavy armor entirely, reverberating through its internal mechanics. The machine shuddered, its optical sensor flashing rapidly before going dark, and collapsed into a heap of sparking scrap metal. 1 point, Izuku thought. He shook out his hand, feigning a slight wince for the cameras. I need 35 to comfortably pass the practical without drawing undue attention to myself. 40, to account for potential grading curves. Let's get to work. For the next 10 minutes, Izuku performed a masterclass in aggressive mediocrity. He didn't unleash flashy blasts of power. He didn't level entire city blocks. He moved through the exam zone like a phantom, finding isolated robots and dismantling them with terrifying efficiency. He allowed the 2-pointers and 3-pointers to strike him, absorbing their kinetic payload, and returned the force with surgical strikes to their joints, visual sensors, and power couplings. He moved with absolute economy. There were no wasted steps. If a robot was out of reach, he didn't chase it, he let it come to him. If another applicant was engaged in a fight, Izuku steered clear, ensuring no one could closely observe his technique. High above in the observation deck, the faculty of UA High School watched the screens in silence. We have quite a crop this year, Midnight purred, tapping her chin as she watched Katsuki Bakugo obliterate a cluster of 3-pointers with a massive, localized explosion. Look at that blonde boy. Raw, destructive power, but he has the instincts to back it up. He's aggressive, Snipe noted, adjusting his mask. Maybe too aggressive. He's not looking for survivors or assisting the others. In the back of the room, standing beside Principal Nizu's chair, Shota Aizawa was entirely ignoring Bakugo's flashy display. His bloodshot, dark eyes were locked dead onto screen 4. Eraser? President Mike called out, noticing his friend's intense focus. What ya looking at? Find a diamond in the rough? Aizawa didn't respond immediately. He leaned closer to the monitor, his brow furrowed so deeply it looked painful. On the screen, Izuku Midoriya was currently facing down 2 3-pointers. One fired a barrage of rubber suppression rounds. The boy didn't panic. He raised his arms, letting the rounds strike his forearms. Then, he sprinted forward, vaulting off a wrecked car, and used the absorbed momentum to deliver a spinning heel kick to the first robot's optical cluster. As the first robot fell, it created a blind spot for the second robot. The boy used the falling machine as a springboard, launching himself at the second robot, and driving his knee into its exposed neck joint. Both machines were neutralized in under 6 seconds. He's acting, Aizawa finally rasped, his voice tight. Nizu took a sip of his tea, a knowing gleam in his dark eyes. Oh? Do tell, Aizawa. Examine his posture, Aizawa said, pointing a bandage-wrapped finger at the screen. The other teachers turned their attention to the green-haired boy. He looks like he's panting. He looks like he's straining when he throws those strikes. But look at his feet. Midnight squinted. His feet? His footwork is flawless, Aizawa explained, his tone laced with a growing, unsettling realization. When a teenager is exhausted, their form gets sloppy. They overcommit to strikes. They lose their balance. But his center of gravity hasn't shifted a single millimeter since the exam started. He's placing his feet precisely where they need to be to maximize leverage and minimize energy output. A martial artist? Snipe suggested. Maybe he trains in a dojo. No dojo teaches you how to fight multiple mechanized targets in an urban environment with zero hesitation, Aizawa countered, his eyes narrowing. He's letting them hit him to charge his quirk. But he's not bracing for the impacts. He's relaxing his muscles just before contact to maximize absorption. That requires a level of combat reflex that takes decades to master. He's not trying to survive out there. He's doing math. He's doing exactly enough to pass, and nothing more. Nisa chuckled softly, a sound that made the hairs on Aizawa's arms stand up. Perceptive as always, Shota. Shall we test his true mettle then? It's time for the main event. Nisa slammed his paw down on a large red button on the console. Down in Battle Center B, the ground began to quake. Izuku stopped, dusting off his hands after dismantling his 12th robot. He had 42 points. It was exactly where he wanted to be. But then the shadows lengthened, and a shadow fell over the mock city. Buildings crumbled as a massive, towering monstrosity burst from the pavement. The zero-pointer. It was a colossal, tread-driven behemoth the size of a skyscraper, designed solely to incite panic and test the applicant's flight response. Dust and debris rained down. Applicants began screaming, abandoning their fights, and sprinting toward the exit gates. Ah! The psychological test, Izuku thought calmly, gazing up at the metal titan. Impressive engineering. Wasteful, but impressive. He turned to leave. He had his points. There was no need to engage a target worth 0 points. Oh! Help! Izuku's head snapped to the right. Through the swirling dust, about 40 meters away, a girl with short brown hair was pinned beneath a massive slab of concrete that had been dislodged by the zero-pointer's treads. The giant robot was slowly rolling forward, completely oblivious to the girl and its path. Izuku sighed. So much for staying under the radar. He dropped his facade. The slouch vanished from his shoulders. The mock exhaustion faded from his breathing. His emerald eyes hardened into chips of cold jade. He didn't run toward the girl. The robot was too close to her. Moving her would risk crushing her further if the concrete shifted. He had to stop the machine. Izuku calculated the kinetic energy required to halt an object of that mass. His current stored energy wasn't enough. He needed more. He needed terminal velocity. Izuku sprinted toward the nearest standing skyscraper. He didn't use the stairs. He leapt toward the side of the building, grabbing a drainage pipe. Using a fraction of his stored kinetic energy, he propelled himself upward, scaling the sheer vertical face of the building in massive, gravity-defying bounds. In 3 seconds he was on the roof, level with the zero-pointer's head. He didn't hesitate. Izuku sprinted to the edge of the roof and hurled himself into the open air, diving directly toward the behemoth's face. As he fell, he allowed gravity to do the work. The wind roared in his ears. He focused his aegis, funneling the immense, compounding kinetic energy of his own free fall directly into his right fist. His arm began to glow with a brilliant, blinding white light, not from One for All, but from the raw, superheated friction of pure kinetic force. To the cameras, it looked like a desperate, suicidal punch. But Izuku wasn't aiming for the thick armor of the faceplate. He twisted in midair, slipping past the giant swinging arm of the robot, and drove his glowing fist directly into the recessed, vulnerable joint connecting the robot's neck to its main chassis. Release, Izuku whispered. The sound of the impact was like a thunderclap. The kinetic energy of his fall, multiplied and compressed by his quirk, exploded outward into the machine's internal mechanics. The shockwave rippled through the zero-pointer's frame. The massive neck joint sheared completely off. The robot's head snapped backward, its internal wiring sparking violently. The behemoth groaned, its momentum entirely shattered, and began to topple backward, away from the trapped girl. Izuku didn't stick the landing like a superhero. That would be too suspicious. Instead, as he fell to the street below, he forcefully dislocated his own right shoulder, allowing himself to hit the pavement hard and roll, coming to a stop in a cloud of dust. He lay there, panting, gripping his limp arm, playing the role of the reckless, injured boy who had pushed himself beyond his limits. The exam ended a buzzer later. In the observation room, there was absolute silence. He took it down with a single kinetic strike. Midnight breathed, her eyes wide. He weaponized his own terminal velocity. Aizawa was leaning so far forward he was almost touching the monitor. He had seen the boy dislocate his own shoulder. It hadn't been an accident of the fall. He had seen the subtle muscle contraction, the deliberate, controlled twist of the bone before impact. The boy had injured himself on purpose to make the feat look like a desperate, amateurish fluke. "He's a monster," Aizawa whispered, a cold sweat breaking out on the back of his neck. "A wolf wearing a sheep's skin." "Nizu, who the hell did you let into this school?" Nizu smiled, his teeth glinting in the monitor's light. "I believe, Shota, we have just found our most interesting student in a century." A week later, the acceptance letter arrived. Izuku opened it in the privacy of his bedroom. A small holographic projector fell out, displaying a pre-recorded message from All Might, announcing his acceptance into UA's Hero Course, Class 1A. He had scored 42 villain points, and an astounding 60 rescue points for saving Achiko Uraraka, placing him near the very top of the roster. Izuku watched the holographic projection of All Might with a mixture of melancholy and exhaustion. The man looked so vibrant, so heroic in his muscle form, but Izuku could see the subtle strain around his eyes, the way his breath hitched slightly when he projected his voice. The wound AFO had dealt him 5 years ago was killing him, and One for All was eating away at what little stamina he had left. "You're running out of time, Tashinori," Izuku thought, crushing the holographic disc back into its envelope. And so is the world. The first day of UA arrived with the blooming of the cherry blossoms. Izuku walked through the halls of the massive academy, adjusting the collar of his pristine gray blazer. He found the door marked 1A, an oversized barrier designed to accommodate mutation quirks. He took a deep breath, slipped on his mask of nervous adolescence, and opened the door. Instantly, he was assaulted by noise. "Take your feet off that desk. It is an insult to the great alumni of UA." Tenya Ida, the boy with the engine calves, was chopping his arms aggressively at Katsuki Bakugo, who was indeed resting his boots on his desk, leaning back with a look of supreme boredom. "Like I care, Four Eyes," Bakugo sneered, small explosions popping on his fingertips. "What middle school are you from? You look like a stuck-up extra." "I am Tenya Ida, from semi-private academy." "Sama? So you're a damn elite? I'm gonna have fun crushing you." Izuku hovered in the doorway, observing the room. He took a mental inventory of every student. A boy with a tail. A girl with earphone jacks. A boy with bird-like features and a shadowy entity hovering over his shoulder. A boy with dual-colored hair, emanating a freezing chill on his right side and suppressed heat on his left. Endeavor's creation, Izuku noted, his eyes lingering on Shoto Todoroki. He felt a pang of deep, ancient anger toward the flame hero. To breed a childlike livestock for power, humanity's hubris never changes. "Ah, you're the plain-looking boy." Izuku turned to see the round-faced girl from the exam, Achiko Uraraka, beaming at him. "You passed. I knew you would, after what you did. That punch was amazing." "Oh, thank you," Izuku stuttered perfectly, blushing and rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just lucky I didn't break my whole arm, haha. If you're here to socialize, then get out." The voice was dry, exhausted, and devoid of any warmth. Izuku didn't jump, but the rest of the class froze. Lying on the floor outside the classroom, zipped entirely inside a yellow sleeping bag like an overgrown caterpillar, was Shota Aizawa. He unzipped the bag and stood up, pulling a juice pouch from his pocket and taking a loud slurp. "This is the hero course," Aizawa drawled, stepping over the threshold. He let his gaze sweep across the terrified teenagers, but Izuku noticed with chilling clarity that Aizawa's eyes lingered on him for a fraction of a second longer than the others. He knows, Izuku realized instantly. Or at least, he suspects. The underground hero, Eraserhead. Quirk, Erasure. A tactical genius who fights entirely through misdirection, psychological warfare, and close-quarters combat. He recognized my movements during the exam. Izuku felt a faint, genuine smile tug at the corner of his lips. Finally, someone who spoke his language. It took you lot 8 seconds to quiet down, Aizawa said, stepping up to the podium. Time is limited. You kids are not rational enough. I'm your homeroom teacher, Shota Aizawa. Nice to meet you. He reached into his sleeping bag and pulled out a stack of blue pea uniforms. Put these on and head out to the training grounds. We're doing a quirk apprehension test. The class erupted into confused mutters, but Izuku simply took his uniform and headed to the locker room. 10 minutes later, Class 1A stood on the dirt field under the blazing sun. Aizawa stood before them with a clipboard. A quirk apprehension test? Uraraka asked nervously. What about the entrance ceremony? Or orientation? If you're going to become a hero, you don't have time for such leisurely events, Aizawa replied coldly. UA's selling point is how unrestricted its school traditions are. That's also how the teachers run their classes. You kids have been doing these standard fitness tests since middle school, but without using your quirks. It's irrational. The Ministry of Education is procrastinating. Aizawa turned his gaze to Bakugo. Bakugo, you finished first in the practical exam. In junior high, what was your best result for the softball throw? 67 meters, Bakugo scoffed. Try doing it with your quirk. Aizawa tossed a baseball to the blond boy. Do whatever you want, just don't leave the circle. Hurry up. Give it all you've got. Bakugo smirked, stretching his arms. He stepped into the circle, reeled back, and unleashed a massive blast of nitroglycerin-fueled fire. Die! Bakugo roared. The ball shot into the sky like a mortar shell, leaving a trail of black smoke. Aizawa held up a digital device. It read 705.2 meters. The class gasped in awe. 705 meters? Seriously? This looks like fun. We can use our quirks as much as we want. As expected of the hero course, Aizawa's eyes narrowed dangerously, his capture scarf shifting slightly around his neck. Fun, you say? You have 3 years to become heroes. Will you have an attitude like that the whole time? He smiled, a dark, terrifying expression. Right. Whoever comes in last place in all 8 tests will be judged to have no potential, and will be punished with expulsion. The class erupted in panic. Expulsion on the first day? That's totally unfair. Izuku simply adjusted his shoelaces. A logical ruse. Standard psychological conditioning meant to forcefully extract maximum potential under stress. Effective, but juvenile. Welcome to UA's hero course, Aizawa finished, tossing his hair back. The tests began. Izuku approached each event like a mathematician solving a complex equation. He needed to avoid last place, but he also needed to avoid placing in the top 3. He needed to remain perfectly, unremarkably average, while secretly testing the limits of Aizawa's perception. Test 1, 50-meter dash. Izuku lined up next to Ida. As the starting gun fired, Izuku activated his kinetic absorption quirk. He didn't absorb energy from an external blow. Instead, he hyperfocused the quirk, absorbing the microscopic kinetic energy generated by the friction of his own blood pumping and his muscles contracting. He channeled that energy directly into his legs. He ran the dash in 5.8 seconds. Fast, impressive for a kinetic quirk user, but nowhere near Ida's 3.04 seconds. Aizawa jotted down the time, his eyes tracking Izuku's perfectly controlled breathing. Not a single drop of sweat, Aizawa noted. No heavy breathing. He barely tried. Test 2, grip strength. Izuku held the digital dynamometer. Mizo Shoji, the boy with multiple arms, had just scored an absurd 540 kilograms. Izuku squeezed the device. He could, if he wished, shatter the machine into dust with his bare hands using the raw, ancient strength he had cultivated over centuries. Instead, he channeled just enough kinetic energy to hit 85 kilograms, then deliberately faked a pained gasp, releasing the grip and shaking his hand. Aizawa watched from the sidelines, his erasure quirk flaring briefly. He noticed how Izuku's hand wasn't actually red or strained. He faked the physical recoil. He's actively regulating his scores. Test 5, the softball throw. This was the crucible. Uraraka had scored infinity. Bakugo had set the baseline at 705.2. Izuku was the last to throw. He stepped into the circle, the baseball feeling light as a feather in his hand. He looked down the field. He could throw it a kilometer with ease. He could throw it into orbit if he unlocked the second seal of his aegis. But he needed to sell the narrative of a boy struggling to control a volatile quirk. Izuku wound his arm back, preparing to channel a massive burst of kinetic energy into his fingertips, mimicking the self-destructive nature of one for all without actually breaking his bones. Suddenly, the air around him grew heavy. A strange, suffocating pressure wrapped around his soul. Izuku gasped, his eyes widening. For the first time in 200 years, he felt his connection to the Aegis go completely dark. The deep, warm anchor in his chest vanished, leaving behind a cold, hollow emptiness. It was a terrifying, deeply unnatural sensation for a man whose quirk had defined his biology for centuries. He threw the ball. Without his kinetic enhancement, it sailed a pathetic 46 meters. Izuku stood in the circle, genuinely stunned. He turned his head slowly. Standing a few meters away, Shota Aizawa's hair was floating, his capture scarf writhing like a nest of vipers, and his bloodshot eyes were glowing a brilliant, piercing red. "I erased your quirk," Aizawa said, his voice dripping with venom. "The judges at the exam were blind. Someone like you, you're a liability. Your quirk is powerful, but you clearly have no real control over it. You were planning to use it in a burst, weren't you? Hoping the shockwave would carry the ball, disregarding the damage it might do to your own body. You think someone will just come and save you when you break yourself?" Izuku stared at Aizawa. Internally, Izuku wasn't insulted. He was profoundly impressed. Erasure was a magnificent, god-tier quirk. To sever the metaphysical connection between a human's soul and their genetic factor just by looking at them? If AFO ever got his hands on Aizawa, the world would truly end. But Izuku had a role to play. He forced his eyes to well up with tears. He let his lips tremble. He hunched his shoulders, making himself look as small and pathetic as possible. I wasn't," Izuku stammered, his voice breaking. "I was just trying to do my best." "Your best isn't good enough if it leaves you incapacitated," Aizawa snapped, walking closer. "You're trying to hide behind a facade of effort. But I see through you. You don't belong here, kid. You're trying to play hero, but you lack the basic fundamental understanding of your own power. Return your quirk. Take your second throw. And when you fail, you're going home." Aizawa blinked. His hair fell, and his eyes returned to normal. Instantly, the aegis rushed back into Izuku's chest. The warmth returned. Izuku took a deep, shaky breath, wiping a fake tear from his eye. "He thinks I'm reckless. He thinks I lack control. Very well. Let's show him exactly how much control I have." Izuku picked up a second baseball. He didn't look at Bakugo, who was grinning viciously on the sidelines. He didn't look at All Might, who he knew was hiding behind a corner of the school building, watching anxiously. He looked dead at Aizawa. Izuku wound up for the pitch. He didn't channel the energy through his whole arm. That would be too obvious. Instead, he drew upon every ounce of kinetic energy he had stored during the previous tests, compressing it down, until it was entirely concentrated into the tip of his right index finger. He threw the ball. At the exact millisecond the ball left his fingertips, he released the energy. Smash! A sonic boom echoed across the field, kicking up a massive cloud of dust. The ball vanished into the stratosphere, leaving a visible trail of displaced air in its wake. The class screamed, covering their ears from the concussive shockwave. Aizawa's device beeped. He looked down at the screen. 705.3 meters. Exactly 0.1 meters further than Katsuki Bakugo. Aizawa's eyes widened slightly. He looked up, expecting to see the boy screaming in agony, his arm shattered, or his finger broken. But Izuku Midoriya was standing perfectly still in the circle. His right index finger was slightly red from the friction, but it was entirely unbroken. He wasn't crying anymore. The timid, trembling posture was gone. He stood tall, his hands resting casually at his sides. Izuku turned his head, his emerald eyes locking onto Aizawa's dark gaze. For a split second, the veil dropped completely. Izuku offered Aizawa a cold, calculating, infinitely old smile. Sensei, Izuku said, his voice entirely devoid of the stuttering teenager from 10 seconds ago. It was smooth, calm, and terrifyingly steady. I can still move. Aizawa felt a cold bead of sweat roll down the side of his face. He didn't just control it. He micromanaged the kinetic output down to the decimal point to beat Bakugo, specifically to mock him, and he faked the breakdown perfectly to lower my guard. What the hell was that? Bakugo erupted from the crowd, his palms exploding. Deku! You bastard! Tell me how you did that! You've been hiding your quirk from me? Bakugo lunged at Izuku, ready to kill. Before Aizawa could activate Erasure, Izuku moved. He didn't strike Bakugo. He simply sidestepped the explosive lunge with flawless, agonizingly perfect footwork. As Bakugo flew past him, Izuku casually extended his foot, hooking Bakugo's ankle and sending the blonde boy crashing face first into the dirt with a heavy thud. Izuku didn't even look back at him. He just walked out of the circle, rejoining the stunned, silent class. Aizawa stared at the green-haired boy, a grim realization settling over him. Mizu was right. This kid isn't a student. He's a sleeper agent. But for who? The sun was setting on Yui High School, painting the endless glass corridors in hues of bloody orange and deep violet. The first day had ended. Izuku had technically placed 12th in the overall fitness tests, expertly flying under the radar while leaving Aizawa with a head full of paranoid questions. None of the students were expelled. It had been a logical ruse, just as Izuku predicted. Izuku was walking down a secluded hallway on the 4th floor, making his way to the exit. He enjoyed the quiet. The modern architecture of Yui was beautiful in the twilight. It reminded him of a glass cathedral he had hidden in during the early 1940s. Suddenly, his ears twitched. Ha ha cough. It was a wet, ragged sound, echoing from the stairwell ahead. Izuku's centuries-honed senses instantly identified the biological markers. A severely compromised respiratory system. A missing left lung. A destroyed stomach. Blood pooling in the esophagus. It was Toshinori Yagi. All might. Izuku quickened his pace, his footsteps completely silent. He rounded the corner of the stairwell just in time to see the colossal, muscle-bound form of the symbol of peace suddenly deflate in a cloud of steam. Where the towering hero had stood, a skeletal, emaciated man with sunken eyes and baggy clothes stumbled forward. Toshinori convulsed violently, coughing a massive wad of blood into his hand. His knees buckled, and he pitched forward, tumbling toward the steep, concrete steps of the stairwell. He was going to fall. In his weakened state, the impact could shatter his frail bones. Toshinori squeezed his eyes shut, bracing for the agony. It never came. A hand, small but possessing a grip like forged iron, clamped onto his wrist. Another arm, entirely immovable, wrapped around his emaciated waist, arresting his momentum instantly. Toshinori gasped, his eyes flying open. Standing on the step above him, holding the weight of a grown man with absolutely zero effort, was young Izuku Midoriya. Whoa there, Izuku said gently, easily pulling Toshinori upright and leaning him against the wall of the stairwell. Toshinori was paralyzed. Not just by the shock of being caught, but by the sheer, terrifying speed at which the boy had moved. 1 second the hallway was empty, and the next, Midoriya was there. Toshinori hadn't even perceived the movement. Young Midoriya? Toshinori wheezed, wiping the blood from his chin, panic rising in his chest. He saw me. He saw my true form. The secret is out. Are you alright, sir? Izuku asked, his voice soft. But he wasn't looking at Toshinori with the wide, star-struck eyes of a fanba. He was looking at him with the clinical, melancholic gaze of a doctor examining a terminally ill patient. I am fine, my boy, Toshinori stammered, trying to force a laugh, though it sounded like a death rattle. Just a bit dizzy. Say, you wouldn't happen to know who I am, would you? Izuku let go of Toshinori's waist. He took a step back, folding his hands behind his back. The sunset light illuminated half of Izuku's face, casting the other half in deep shadow. In that lighting, the boy looked ancient. I know exactly who you are, Toshinori Yagi, Izuku said quietly. Toshinori flinched. He knows my real name? How? That's highly classified. Izuku looked at the sunken chest, the horrific scar hidden beneath the baggy shirt. He could feel the dying embers of one for all flickering inside the man. It broke Izuku's heart. Tashinori had sacrificed everything, his body, his future, his humanity, to carry Yoichi's torch. He was a true hero. But he was also a foolish, stubborn man who was working himself into an early grave. Izuku reached into his pocket and pulled out a pristine white handkerchief. He stepped forward and gently pressed it into Tashinori's trembling, blood-stained hand. "You push yourself too hard," Izuku said, his voice dropping the high-pitched, boyish cadence entirely. It was deep, resonant, and heavy with the weight of centuries. Tashinori froze. The sheer authority in the boy's voice was suffocating. It wasn't the authority of a teacher or a pro-hero. It was the authority of a monarch. Tashinori couldn't speak. His brain couldn't process the paradigm shift. This was Katsuki Bakugo's weak, timid, late-blooming childhood friend. Why did it feel like Tashinori was standing in the presence of a god? Izuku smiled, a sad, nostalgic, deeply tired smile. "Nana would scold you for neglecting your health," Tashinori, Izuku said softly. "She told you to smile to trick the fear inside of you. Not to smile to hide your bleeding from the world." The world stopped spinning. Tashinori stopped breathing. His sunken eyes widened to the size of saucers. All the color drained from his already pale face. Nana. No one knew that name. No one knew his master's name, or her teachings, or the exact phrasing she used when they trained on the beach 40 years ago. That was a secret buried in the grave. "How?" Tashinori whispered, his voice trembling so violently he could barely form the words. "How do you know that name? What are you?" Izuku didn't answer. He just gave the skeletal man one last, pitying look, then turned away. As Izuku walked down the stairs, his posture shifted. His shoulders slumped. His head bobbed slightly. The suffocating aura vanished entirely, replaced by the nervous, bumbling energy of a 15-year-old boy. "Have a good evening, All Might," Izuku called back cheerfully, his voice squeaking slightly, perfectly in character. "I'll do my best in class tomorrow." Izuku rounded the corner, leaving Tashinori Yagi alone in the stairwell. The symbol of peace slowly slid down the concrete wall, collapsing onto the stairs. He gripped the white handkerchief in his hand, his heart pounding a frantic, terrified rhythm against his broken ribs. "Nana," Tashinori thought, a tear slipping down his gaunt cheek. "Master, what kind of monster has inherited your power's rival?" Outside, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, plunging Yue High School into twilight. The wolf had entered the fold, and the game had truly begun. The bus ride to the unforeseen simulation joint was agonizingly mundane, a stark contrast to the storm brewing on the horizon of Izuku Midoriya's centuries-old instincts. He sat near the back of the bus, his elbows resting on his knees, projecting the image of a nervous teenager trying to make himself as small as possible. The air conditioning hummed, the tires hummed against the asphalt, and the idle chatter of Class 1A filled the enclosed space. "Midoriya," Tsuyu Ajiri croaked, turning her large, unblinking eyes toward him. "I usually speak my mind. Your quirk, that kinetic energy thing, it's really versatile. But it's strange." Izuku forced a flustered squeak, waving his hands in a frantic, defensive gesture. "As strange? How so, Ajiri? Call me Tsuyu. And it's just, during the combat training yesterday, you didn't really attack much. You just let Bakugo blow up everything around you, absorbed the shockwaves, and tripped him. It was almost like you were bored." Izuku's mind raced, though his face remained plastered with an embarrassed sweat drop. She is perceptive. A mutation type with heightened situational awareness. I'll need to be more careful around her. Before Izuku could formulate a perfectly stuttered excuse, Eijiro Kirishima leaned over the aisle. "Yeah, man. You totally schooled Bakugo without even throwing a real punch." Speaking of which, Kirishima glanced toward the front of the bus. "Bakugo's been weirdly quiet today, right?" It was true. Katsuki Bakugo was sitting rigidly in his seat, his arms crossed so tightly his knuckles were white. He hadn't yelled once. He hadn't threatened anyone. Every time the bus hit a bump and Izuku shifted in his seat, Bakugo's shoulders flinched slightly. The aura Izuku had leaked on the street the morning of the entrance exam had done its job too well. The feral Pomeranian had sensed the apex predator, and his instincts were currently at war with his astronomical ego. I'm sure Kaken is just focusing on the rescue training. Izuku lied smoothly, offering a wobbly smile. At the very front of the bus, Shota Aizawa sat wrapped in his yellow sleeping bag, his back to the students. He wasn't asleep. His dark, bloodshot eyes were wide open, staring at the reflection of the students in the rearview mirror. Specifically, he was watching the green-haired boy in the back. Midoriya, Aizawa thought, his jaw clenching. He's been playing the fool for 2 days straight. But I know what I saw on the pitching mound. And I know what All Might told me this morning. Aizawa recalled the frantic, hushed conversation he'd had with Toshinori in the staff room before homeroom. The symbol of peace had looked even more skeletal than usual, visibly trembling as he asked Aizawa to keep an eye on Midoriya. Toshinori had refused to explain why, only muttering something about ghosts and the past. Whatever you are, kid, Aizawa thought, his hand subtly resting on his capture scarf. If you make one wrong move, I'll expel you. Or worse. The bus finally ground to a halt outside a massive, domed facility. The USJ. Izuku stepped off the bus, immediately feeling a shift in the atmospheric pressure. The air here was artificially regulated, heavy with moisture and the scent of simulated environments. Standing before the entrance was the space hero, 13. Izuku offered a polite, invisible bow of his head. He recognized 13's quirk, black hole. He had actually met the original possessor of that specific genetic mutation, a Russian astronomer in the early 1900s who had accidentally consumed his own laboratory when the quirk first manifested. Izuku had helped the man learn to cap the gravitational pull. It was somewhat heartwarming to see the quirk being used so nobly generations later. 13 gave a passionate speech about the dangers of quirks and how easily they could be used to kill. Izuku listened intently. Yes, he agreed silently. A quirk is a loaded gun handed to a child by God. You are one of the few modern heroes who understands this, 13. All right, first things first, Aizawa began, stepping up beside 13. Then, the lights went out. It wasn't a slow dimming. It was an instant, violently abrupt cessation of power. The massive floodlights illuminating the central plaza of the USJ shattered with a chorus of sharp cracks. Izuku didn't gasp like the other students. His posture locked. His breathing slowed to one breath every 10 seconds. The Aegis core in his chest flared to life, sending a wave of absolute, freezing clarity through his nervous system. Down in the central plaza, the air began to tear. It started as a small speck of purple-black mist, swirling like a drop of ink in a glass of water. Then, it violently expanded, ripping a hole in the fabric of reality. Izuku recognized that mist. He recognized the spatial distortion. A warping quirk, Izuku thought, his emerald eyes narrowing in the darkness. Highly advanced. But the energy signature is fragmented. It's not natural. It's a stitched-together amalgamation of 3 different spatial quirks I encountered during the Destro era, which meant only one person could have created it. All for one. From the violet mist, a hand emerged. Pale, sickly, grasping. Then came the man. Or rather, the boy. He was painfully thin, draped in black clothes, and covered in disembodied, embalmed hands that gripped his face, arms, and torso. Izuku's breath hitched. For a fraction of a second, the ironclad control of the verdant sentinel wavered. He didn't just see a villain. He saw the stark white hair. He saw the blood-red eyes peering through the fingers of the hand covering the boy's face. Nana's grandson, Izuku realized, an ancient, profound sorrow washing over him. He had known Tenko Shimura was missing. He had searched for the boy for years after the tragedy that befell Nana's family, but he had been too late. AFO had found him first. Eraserhead and 13, the white-haired boy rasped, his voice echoing up the concrete steps. According to the teacher's schedule we retrieved the other day, All Might is supposed to be here. The boy scratched his neck violently. Where is he? I went through all this trouble, and brought so many of my friends, just to kill the symbol of peace. Is he not here? Izuku felt a chill deeper than ice settle into his bones. He listened to the boy's cadence. The arrogance. The theatrical, childish petulance masking a deep, festering hatred. It was a perfect mirror. AFO hadn't just taken Nana's grandson and twisted him into a weapon to hurt All Might. AFO had molded the boy into a grotesque imitation of his own past self. He even dresses him like he used to dress in the ruins of Tokyo, Izuku realized, his fists clenching so hard his knuckles popped. You sick, twisted bastard, villains, Aizawa growled, pulling his goggles over his eyes and unfurling his capture scarf. No moving! Those are villains! The students panicked. The realization that they were under a real, lethal attack shattered their naive illusions of heroism. 13. Begin evacuation. Try calling the school. Aizawa commanded, leaping down the stairs into the fray. Izuku didn't move. He watched Aizawa dismantle the first wave of low-tier thugs. The man was a brilliant fighter, maximizing his erasure quirk to nullify threats before relying on martial arts. But Izuku's tactical mind instantly ran the calculations. Aizawa is an ambush fighter. His stamina is designed for quick, decisive takedowns in the dark. He is fighting a war of attrition against 70 opponents in broad daylight. He will exhaust his ocular stamina in less than 8 minutes. Suddenly, the purple mist expanded right in front of the students. I won't let you, a deep, echoing voice vibrated from the mist. A pair of glowing yellow eyes narrowed at the class. Greetings. We are the League of Villains. It may be presumptuous of us, but we have invited ourselves into UA High School to have All Might take his last breath. Bakugo and Kirishima didn't wait. They lunged, setting off a massive explosion right in the center of the mist. No! Get back! 13 yelled. Izuku could have stopped it. He could have released a fraction of his kinetic power to pull them back. But he felt the spatial distortion warping around them. The mist wasn't just a portal. It was a localized black hole. My job is to scatter you all, and torture you to death, Kurojiri announced. The purple mist swept over the class like a tidal wave. Izuku didn't fight it. He simply allowed himself to fall backward into the void, maintaining perfect physical equilibrium as reality twisted around him. Splash! Izuku hit the water of the shipwreck zone with a perfectly executed dive, producing almost zero splash. He opened his eyes in the salty water, immediately locating Tsuyu and Mineta struggling a few meters away. Above them, on the deck of a sinking yacht, a dozen aquatic villains were waiting with harpoons and mutated claws. Tsuyu grabbed Mineta and Izuku with her tongue, hauling them out of the water and tossing them onto the deck of the yacht. Ribbit. This is bad, Tsuyu croaked, analyzing the villains encircling the boat. They knew the layout of the facility. They brought aquatic villains specifically for this zone. Mineta was sobbing hysterically, pulling the purple spheres from his head. We're gonna die. We're gonna die. We haven't even touched a boob yet. Izuku stood up slowly. His clothes were soaked, clinging to his lithe frame. He looked out at the villains in the water. They were laughing, taunting the children, acting like hyenas circling wounded prey. They are fodder, Izuku assessed. Desperate men given a scrap of power by a madman. Pathetic. Midoriya, what do we do? Tsuyu asked, her voice tight with fear though she masked it well. Izuku closed his eyes. The time for playing the helpless victim was rapidly coming to an end, but he needed to maintain the illusion of his quirk for just a little longer. He needed to get out of this zone and get to Aizawa. Ajui. Mineta, Izuku said. His voice was no longer trembling. It was calm. Too calm. I have a plan. But you need to trust me entirely. Mineta stopped crying for a second, looking at the green-haired boy. There was something in Midoriya's eyes that made Mineta's spine tingle. It was a complete absence of fear. Mineta, Izuku ordered, throw as many of your spheres into the water as you can. Blanket the surface. What? But they'll just avoid them. Do it. It wasn't a request. It was a command laced with a microscopic fraction of the Sentinel's authority. Mineta whimpered and began rapidly plucking the spheres from his head, tossing them into the water around the yacht. Ajui, grab Mineta and jump as high as you can. Don't look down. What about you, Midoriya? Tsuyu asked. I'll follow. Tsuyu nodded. She wrapped her tongue around Mineta's waist and crouched, her powerful leg muscles contracting. With a massive leap, she launched them both high into the air above the dome. Look at those idiots. They're abandoning ship. One of the villains laughed from the water, raising a harpoon gun. I'll skewer him! He never got the chance. Izuku stepped to the edge of the yacht's railing. He didn't look like a student anymore. His posture was perfectly rigid. He raised his right leg, drawing upon the immense kinetic energy of his own hyperaccelerated heartbeat and the kinetic friction of the water he had absorbed during his fall. He didn't just kick the air. He executed a localized, hypercompressed kinetic strike, a technique he had developed in the 1920s to shatter naval blockades. Delaware Smash Modified. Izuku snapped his leg downward in a crescent arc, striking the surface of the water with his heel. The impact sounded like a detonating depth charge. A massive, concussive shockwave ripped through the shipwreck zone. The water didn't just splash, it parted. A massive whirlpool formed instantly, a localized tsunami roaring outward from the sheer kinetic displacement of Izuku's strike. The villains in the water screamed as they were caught in the violently churning vortex. As they spun out of control, they crashed into the sticky purple spheres Mineta had scattered, instantly clumping together into a massive, helpless ball of groaning bodies. Izuku didn't wait to watch the result. He utilized the recoil of his own kick to launch himself backward, soaring through the air to intercept Tsuyu and Mineta mid-flight. He grabbed them both by the collars of their uniforms and expertly adjusted their trajectory, landing silently on the shallow edge of the central plaza. How did you do that? Mineta shrieked, looking back at the whirlpool. That was like All Might's power. Kinetic displacement, Izuku lied smoothly, his eyes already locked on the center of the plaza. I stored the kinetic energy of my fall and released it into the water. Tsuyu looked at Izuku. Her frog-like instincts were screaming at her. He's not breathing hard. His leg isn't broken. He did that with the casual ease of someone swiping a fly away. But Izuku wasn't paying attention to them anymore. He was staring at the center of the plaza. Aizawa was surrounded. He was bleeding from his head, his goggles shattered, panting heavily. And standing in front of him was Shigaraki. 23 seconds, Shigaraki murmured, counting Aizawa's blink rate. Your stamina is pathetic, Eraserhead. Shigaraki lunged. Aizawa's hair fell for a fraction of a second as he blinked. Shigaraki's hand clamped onto Aizawa's elbow. Izuku watched in horror as the skin, muscle, and bone of Aizawa's arm began to crumble into dust. Aizawa screamed, a gut-wrenching sound of pure agony, and threw a desperate punch, but the damage was done. His arm was destroyed. You're cool, Eraserhead, Shigaraki smiled beneath the hand on his face. But you're not the final boss. Shigaraki raised his hand. Noma. Behind Shigaraki, a shadow moved. Izuku's eyes widened. Standing there was a hulking, unnatural abomination. Its skin was pitch black, its muscles bulging to cartoonish proportions. Its brain was exposed, protruding from its skull, and a massive, bird-like beak rested where its mouth should be. But the physical appearance wasn't what made Izuku freeze. It was the metaphysical signature. Through the lens of the Aegis, Izuku saw quirks as colors, as distinct melodies of a person's soul. When he looked at a normal person, he saw one beautiful, solitary flame. When he looked at the Nomu, he saw a roaring, agonizing inferno of mutilated souls. Shock absorption. Super regeneration. Muscular hypertrophy. Pain nullification. 4 distinct quirks. 4 distinct genetic factors, brutally amputated from innocent people, violently stitched together, and forcefully crammed into a single, brain-dead vessel. It was an affront to nature. It was the ultimate blasphemy against everything the Verdant Sentinel had protected for 2 centuries. No, Izuku whispered. The Nomu moved faster than the human eye could track. It materialized behind Aizawa and brought its massive fists down. Crack. The sound of Aizawa's arms and skull fracturing echoed across the plaza. The pro-hero was driven face first into the concrete, his blood pooling rapidly around his head. The Nomu grabbed his broken arm, twisting it backward like a brittle twig. Sensei! Tsuyu screamed, taking a step forward. Shigaraki turned his head. He spotted the 3 students hiding in the shallows. Ah, Shigaraki smiled. More lives to crush. If I kill his students right in front of him, maybe All Might will finally show up. Shigaraki disappeared in a burst of speed, lunging directly at Tsuyu. His hand reached out, all 5 fingers spread, aimed squarely at her face. Aizawa, barely clinging to consciousness, forced his bloody head up, his eyes flashing red to erase Shigaraki's quirk. But Aizawa was too late. He blinked. The fingers descended. Time stopped for Izuku Midoriya. 200 years of playing the pacifist, 200 years of hiding in the shadows, 200 years of restraining his own godhood to let humanity grow on its own. All of it vanished in the span of a single, agonizing heartbeat. He is using my brother's power to create abominations, Izuku thought, a cold, absolute fury taking hold of his soul. He is using Nana's grandson to murder children. I am done hiding. Shigaraki's hand was an inch from Tsuya's face. Then, the world tilted. A hand wrapped around Shigaraki's wrist. It wasn't a desperate, scrambling block. It was a vice grip of immovable, cold iron. Shigaraki gasped, his red eyes widening in shock. Standing between him and Tsuya was the green-haired boy. But the boy's posture was no longer slouched. He stood perfectly, terrifyingly straight. His emerald eyes were devoid of panic, devoid of the naive heroism Shigaraki despised. They were bottomless, ancient pools of utter disdain. Decay! Shigaraki shrieked, expecting the boy's arm to crumble to dust. Nothing happened. The Aegis didn't just block quirks. It devoured them. The moment Shigaraki's volatile quirk energy tried to enter Izuku's body, the Aegis simply neutralized it, swallowing the destructive force into the void of Izuku's soul. What? Shigaraki stammered, pulling frantically, but his wrist was locked in place as if bolted to a titanium pillar. Noma! Kill him! The behemoth dropped Aizawa's broken body and roared, lunging at Izuku with a fist capable of leveling a skyscraper. Izuku didn't look at the Noma. He didn't even turn his head. Seal 1, Izuku whispered. Release. He didn't scream it. He didn't power up with a flashy aura. He spoke the words with the quiet reverence of a priest unlocking a crypt. Deep within his soul, the first layer of the vault groaned open. Izuku accessed a quirk he had taken from a tyrant warlord in the late 1700s. A quirk so devastating it had brought entire armies to their knees. Absolute gravimetric domination. Izuku didn't throw a punch. He simply let go of Shigaraki's wrist and raised his right hand, his palm facing the charging Noma. The air in the USJ didn't just grow heavy. It solidified. A microscopic black sphere, no larger than a marble, manifested directly above the Noma's head. The gravitational pull within a 10-meter radius was instantly magnified by 500 times. Crash! The Noma, moving at Mach 1, was violently slammed into the concrete floor. The impact was so severe that the entire central plaza caved in, creating a massive, perfectly spherical crater 20 meters deep. The students watching from the outskirts of the plaza, Bakugo, Todoroki, Kirishima, who had just managed to fight their way back, were thrown off their feet by the sheer displacement of atmospheric pressure. What the hell was that? Bakugo roared, clutching the ground to avoid being sucked into the gravity well. He looked toward the epicenter, and his jaw dropped. Standing on the absolute edge of the crater, completely unaffected by the localized gravity, was Deku. But his hair wasn't green anymore. It was glowing a stark, luminescent white at the tips, a physical manifestation of the immense metaphysical strain of channeling an ancient quirk. Down in the crater, the Noma roared in agony. Its bones were snapping under the unimaginable pressure. But its super regeneration kicked in. Muscles tore and reknitted themselves instantly. The beast began to slowly, agonizingly push itself up on its hands and knees, fighting against the gravitational force that would have turned a tank into a pancake. It's no use! Shigaraki cackled hysterically, backing away from Izuku. Noma was built to take all might at 100%. It has shock absorption and super regeneration. You can't crush it. Izuku finally turned his head to look at Shigaraki. When their eyes met, Shigaraki stopped laughing. A sudden, violent wave of nausea hit Shigaraki. His vision blurred. Somewhere deep, deep within his genetic code, within the twisted remnants of the quirks AFO had forced into his body, a vestigial memory screamed in terror. It was a primal fear, passed down from his master, the fear of the verdant sentinel. Shock absorption only mitigates kinetic force, Izuku said. His voice was no longer a teenager's. It resonated with a deep, echoing duality, as if 2 centuries of voices were speaking in unison. Gravity is not a kinetic strike. It is a fundamental law of physics. And regeneration requires cellular division. It requires energy. If I crush the cells faster than they can divide, the abomination dies. Izuku slowly closed his hand into a fist. The gravity in the crater doubled. The gnome shrieked, a horrifying, wet sound. Its arms buckled. Its spine snapped in half. The exposed brain began to bulge and rupture under the pressure. Blood sprayed, instantly flattening against the concrete floor. But Izuku wasn't done. He stepped off the edge of the crater, floating down into the gravity well as if walking down an invisible staircase. He landed softly next to the writhing, crushed behemoth. You violate the sanctity of the soul, Izuku whispered, looking down at the beast. I will grant you peace. Izuku reached out and placed his bare hand directly onto the gnome's exposed, pulsing brain. He didn't use kinetic energy. He didn't use gravity. He used his true quirk. The Aegis. The core in Izuku's chest flared with a blinding, emerald light. The light flowed down his arm and poured into the gnome. The Aegis didn't steal the quirks. The vessel was too mangled to survive the extraction. Instead, Izuku aggressively sealed them. He forced his own metaphysical energy into the gnome's genetic factor, building an impenetrable wall around the hijacked quirks. Suddenly, the gnome stopped regenerating. The shock absorption vanished. The muscular hypertrophy deflated. The massive, terrifying bioweapon shriveled into a pale, broken, emaciated husk in a matter of seconds. Izuku dispelled the gravity quirk. The heavy air lifted. The USJ was dead silent, save for the crackling of the broken floodlights. Izuku stood in the center of the ruined plaza, his white-tipped hair slowly fading back to its normal green. He looked down at his hand, stained with the black blood of the Nomu, and felt a profound sense of exhaustion. He had broken his cover. The world would know. AFO would know. Nomu. Shigaraki whispered, his voice trembling uncontrollably. He fell to his knees, clutching the hand on his face. He deleted them. He deleted the quirks. That's impossible. Who are you? You're a cheater. A hacker. You're a bug in the game. Shigaraki clawed at his neck, drawing blood. The primal terror in his DNA was overwhelming his mind. Kurogyri. Get us out of here. Now. Before he touches us. The purple mist materialized behind Shigaraki, completely abandoning the other villains scattered across the facility. Kurogyri, too, sensed the unnatural, godlike aura radiating from the green-haired boy. We must retreat, Tamura, Kurogyri urged, wrapping his mist around the screaming boy. Izuku didn't pursue them. He simply watched them warp away, his eyes filled with a deep, crushing sorrow. I will save you, Tenko, Izuku vowed silently. I failed your grandmother. I failed my brother. But I will not fail you. The portal snapped shut. The League of Villains was gone. Izuku let out a long, shuddering breath. The adrenaline faded, replaced by the sheer, crushing weight of reality. He turned around slowly. Standing at the edge of the crater, perfectly unharmed, were Tsuyu and Mineta. They were staring at him with their mouths open, completely paralyzed by shock. A little further away, Katsuki Bakugo was standing completely rigid. The blonde boy's red eyes were wide with a terror he had never known. He had bullied this boy for a decade. He had told him to take a swan dive off a roof. And in return, this boy had just casually, effortlessly dismantled a monster designed to kill All Might. Todoroki Shoto's heterochromatic eyes were narrowed, his brilliant mind frantically trying to process what he had just witnessed. That wasn't a kinetic quirk. That was absolute, localized gravity control. And then, he turned the monster's quirks off. He possesses multiple quirks. Izuku walked out of the crater. He didn't limp. He didn't pant. He walked over to Shota Aizawa, who was lying in a pool of his own blood, barely conscious. Izuku knelt down, gently resting a hand on Aizawa's forehead. He channeled a microscopic fraction of the Aegis to stabilize Aizawa's vitals, stopping the internal bleeding. Aizawa's bloodshot eye cracked open. He looked at the boy kneeling over him. You! Aizawa coughed, blood bubbling on his lips. You lied. Izuku offered a small, terribly sad smile. It was the smile of a man who had lived too long. I am sorry, Sensei, Izuku whispered. Some lies are the only things holding the world together. Suddenly, the massive steel doors of the USJ were blown off their hinges. Fear not! A booming, thunderous voice echoed through the facility. The dust cleared to reveal All Might, standing in his muscle form, entirely unsmiling. His blue suit was radiating steam, his eyes shadowed with pure, unadulterated fury. Because I am here. All Might looked down at the plaza. He expected to see his students slaughtered. He expected to see Aizawa dead. Instead, he saw 70 villains unconscious on the ground. He saw a massive, perfectly spherical crater. He saw a shriveled, dead monster, and standing in the center of the carnage, untouched and unbothered, was young Izuka Midoriya. Izuka stood up and met All Might's gaze across the distance of the plaza. For the first time since Yui began, Izuka didn't act like a fanboy. He didn't smile. He simply nodded his head once, a silent acknowledgement from one ancient protector to the current symbol of peace. The seal is broken, Izuka thought, turning his gaze up toward the shattered glass dome of the USJ ceiling. Beyond it, the sky was gray and overcast. The sentinel has returned. Come and find me, brother. I am waiting.